this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Moore. Our discussion today is going to center around the death of a person who ended their own life with a .357 handgun in Canada. But that's not near the end of the tale. As a matter of fact, it's only the beginning. Isn't that interesting in life? You know, you have these beginnings that sometime occur at the end. Because there's an entire story that is going to be revealed and has been revealing itself over many, many years. And still to this day, new pages are written. We're going to talk about a case that Dave and I have previously covered, but there has been a new development. And that development is the identification of a long since dead young father who went missing back in 1993. We now know who he is. And he died, apparently, at the hands of arguably one of the biggest monsters in the history of serial killers in the United States. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Dave, I was thinking about something, as I was kind of putting my thoughts together about what we're going to discuss. And I'll go ahead and open the door for this right now. But Herb Baumeister, who, had this large farm outside of Indianapolis. He had been a successful businessman. And in the wake of his death, there are particulated bits of human remains found all over his property. But that is of interest. But I got to back up just for a second and kind of relay this. And I'd given this a bit of thought. This guy blew his brains out in Ontario, Canada. He cited in a note that he had written, which turned out to be about 3 pages long. By the way, suicide notes are rare. They don't happen like most people think that it does happen. But this guy took the time to write a note that went for 3 pages. And in that note, he stated how he felt down about his marriage falling apart and about business problems and all this. And oh, by the way, he shot himself in apparently like a park in Ontario. And he was regretting, lamenting the fact that he had left a mess for the people to clean up. And I felt as though that was much akin to the captain of the Titanic apologizing for the quality of the food at the last meal the people ate on the Titanic after it had already struck an iceberg. Because that's really the only way I could really frame it in my mind. He never mentioned in his note, not even a whisper, about all of these young men whose lives he had taken and their families whose lives he had also destroyed. It's almost like this kind of twisted worldview. And I think, to say the very least, this guy did in fact have a very twisted worldview.
Buddy, when we did the story the first time on Herb Baumeister, it was because of the headline. If you remember, I think it was the New York Post that had 10,000 remains found which it's correct and not correct at the same time,
Yeah.
But
it's what caught my attention with it, because if you're saying 10,000 remains, right. I'm thinking that we're down in the catacombs somewhere over in France, or one of these places where they take all of the bodies and bury them underground. You got thousands of. That's not what they're talking about. They're actually talking about particulated remains.
Pieces of. I mean, my one finger, on my index finger on this hand could be 1,000 pieces. But any way you look at it, it got attention, and it did bring about the fact that Herb Baumeister, before he killed himself, was possibly one of the top 10 serial killers in the United States of America, because we still don't know the total of number of people he actually killed. In this case today, Joseph Scott Morgan, we actually have somebody who has now been identified as a victim whose remains were found out on Baumeister's property, but he was never part of the discussion within law enforcement as a victim.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, he had gone missing. The man went missing. I'm gonna have to be very gentle on this, because I don't know the situation of the marriage, but we do have a man. His name, Daniel Thomas Halloran. Dan Halloran was married, and he and his wife had a daughter. But for whatever reason, his daughter, now telling the story all these years later, said basically her mother put him on the road, put him on a plane back to Indiana. And it was before, I think she was not even 2 years old yet when this happened.
No, she wasn't. Yeah.
So she's a baby. Mom's had her fill. We're only getting one side of this story. And the reason is because Daniel Halloran went missing almost immediately. They got him on the plane or whatever, sent him back to Indiana, and nothing. He's gone. And so this woman grows up, and imagine this, growing up your entire life, not knowing where your dad is, knowing that, your dad was put on the road, that he doesn't know. Wasn't there at kindergarten. He wasn't there at your 6th grade. He wasn't there at your prom. He's missed out on your entire life. You've never known. And in her case, bless her heart, she said that she wondered some days, is he in the crowd? Is he watching? Is he going to just show up? The dream of every child who has been abandoned by a parent. But in this case, she found out all these years later, and this is not the closure that people think it is, but it actually does begin the process of healing, I think, Joe. Yeah. And it's why you and I love sharing stories of Othram, because this is such an Othram story, DNAsolves.com, the whole thing. This young woman who has grown up without her dad, wondering what happened. Is he here? Is he there? She finds out that he's never been there. He has been dead pretty much since the day he was sent back to Indiana. Yep. They don't know exactly when he died, but they do know that because of Othram, they were able to solve at least the remains, who this is. But Joe, he's one of the people they didn't even consider as a possible victim on the property of Herbert. And that boggles my mind.
It does for me too. Hey, look, I got to tell you, I love Indiana and I love Indianapolis. I've been there several times throughout my career. I've taught coroners in Indiana, and lovely people. My family has spent time up there. I've always said it's kind of like the South in the North. A kind of an agri-based environment.
I've never heard that said.
Yeah, it's kind of got one big city. You got a lot of little small farming towns. I love the movie Hoosiers. What can I say? I can't help it. God rest Gene Hackman's soul.
That and Breaking Away.
I've often thought, well, Indianapolis. I've been there a couple of times for the NCAAs. The basketball tournament. JSU has played up there. And it's a big town. It's not the biggest town. Okay. By far, it's not the biggest town in the U.S. So when you've got a person that is missing that fits a type, okay, relatively young, white male, that has gone missing out of here and seems to have just vanished into thin air. I'm really wondering, why was he not on the list of Baumeister's victims? Why was he never considered? I'll tell you who did consider him, according to Halloran's daughter. Her name is Coral, not Carol, but Coral, like coral reef. she reports to us that Halloran's mother, who would be her grandmother, had told her in the past that she felt as though that her son had actually been a victim of Baumeister. And I find that very intriguing because I think there's a lot that we can kind of speculate about in that context, knowing now what we know about Baumeister. He had according to what the police have said, he had very specific areas that he would literally hunt in, and they are hunters. It makes me think of, I noticed in one of your notes, you had the word Dahmer written in there, where he would frequent the gay bars in Indianapolis, and he would victimize young men there, and he would take them out and do away with them. But here's another interesting part. You hear a lot about the hunting grounds that he had, and also these particulated remains that they're finding at this Fox Hollow farm that he owned. I think it's like 19 acres or something. He lived there with his wife and his 3 kids, Baumeister, that is. And, they make it sound like this beautiful, bucolic place. I think that it probably had a large house on it, extensive property. You hear a lot about those remains, but Dave, there had been young men that were disappearing prior to him moving to Fox Hollow, purchasing Fox Hollow and moving there. And that individual had been named as the I-70 Strangler. And this started, the first of these bodies started popping up in 1980, Dave. In 1980, these bodies had started, and the bodies would be in various states of dress. They were found in wooded areas and ponds, and they were all along the I-70 corridor through that area. It's just that when he moved, the bodies that were dying at the hands of the I-70 Strangler ceased turning up like that. It just stopped, like as of 1990.
All right,
you no longer have
the I-70 Strangler is active. They know they're on to something here. They've got a name for him. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, those stop and no solution. They're going to assume, like the Bundy cases when they ended in Washington and started in Utah, they assumed that whoever was doing the Washington killings, that guy's either in jail or dead. Same thing here. The I-70 Strangler stopped. Okay, maybe he's in jail or dead, on other charges, or came up against somebody and he couldn't beat him or whatever. But in this case, you've got Baumeister, who was leading a double life out at Fox Hollow Farm, where you mentioned the wife and kids. He's got these secondhand thrift stores he's operating, got money coming in. Meanwhile, we've got pieces of remains all over Fox Hollow Farm. And it's beyond frustrating to think that he might have been the I-70 Strangler in that unsolved case before he goes to Fox Hollow. Is that what we're looking at now? That he was this guy, and then he buys Fox Hollow Farm, and now he has a new hunting ground?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. And I'd be very curious to try to understand, if his hunting ground changed as well, because his geographic location obviously changed. Calling this the I-70 Strangler almost gives it an air of kind of a transient nature to it, that is found in the I-70 corridor, but it's not like a specific location. Now you've actually got a person, allegedly, I hate that word, allegedly, that has now got a central location where they're going into the closest metropolitan area, and, kind of hunting in that area and bringing them back to this place and either killing them there or killing them in another location, bringing them back there, and then rendering the bodies down till they're particulated.
Now, okay, you're going to have to explain particulated a little bit, Joe.
Yeah.
But here's the reason I put the note in there about Dahmer.
Yeah.
It's because the Fox Hollow Farm investigation, it's right on the heels of Dahmer, where we had Dahmer, going and frequenting,
he was cruising,
homosexual establishments and killing and all that. And we've got a very similar thing taking place. We're not talking 25 or 30 years we're talking they were actively going on while Dahmer was killing in Milwaukee. There were some deaths down here in Indiana. I'm just wondering why there wasn't some kind of thought process going, well, wait a minute. We've got a very similar thing going on down here with dead gay men or missing gay men, I guess, because they didn't find the bodies because they were out particulated at some point. They're gone. They're missing. But now, particulated, are we talking about, you and I went through this before, and I'm trying to remember, wasn't it crushing them down to the smallest possible?
Yeah. And I'm glad you said that, because one of the terms that has been used to talk about the condition of the remains, two of them, burned and crushed. So if you're going to crush something, first off, you have to get it to let's see, how can I say this? You have to get it into a state where it can be crushed. Now, people would think, well, yeah, you can actually crush somebody's arm that's intact. It can be crushed, in fact. But is it possible to actually crush it down to its base elements? No, it's not. So it has to be rendered down either by stripping tissue or burning tissue. And in this case, I think it was probably burning. Let me throw out some names, city names to you real quick. Chicago, St. Louis, Evansville, Indiana, Louisville, Kentucky, Cincinnati, Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, Fort Wayne, Indiana. All of these cities literally surround Indianapolis as if Indianapolis is the center of a target. And they're all connected, each one of these cities, to interstates that run through each of them, that almost like a giant spider web spread out from Indianapolis. Dave, they have said that Baumeister was a prolific serial killer. Some have even opined that, for all we know, he could be one of the most prolific. When you begin to look at the central location of Indianapolis, and I would encourage anybody to go onto your computer and just search Indianapolis, and then there's always a map that pops up with it, particularly if you do a Google search. Click on that map and zoom out, and you'll see what I'm talking about. It looks like a bullseye with Indianapolis right in the center. I really wonder, Dave, how many other young men, young gay men perhaps, were disappeared out of these other metropolitan areas within easy driving distance of Indianapolis. Because I think that there's a method to his madness. And as we've learned, there was madness here because Baumeister had at some point in his life been diagnosed as a schizophrenic, an untreated schizophrenic. And
what does that actually mean, untreated? Because obviously to get that diagnosis, he's under the care of a physician of some sort, but they chose to not medicate, or he chose to not take it. I mean, that's a dangerous thing to say about somebody.
Yeah, it is. My stepfather was a diagnosed schizophrenic at some point in time. And he had, I always wondered when I was a kid, he'd take us to church all the time and he'd talk about how evil psychiatrists and psychologists were. And, and it wasn't until many years later, he's gone now. It wasn't until many years later that I discovered he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he had this, just this incredible hatred for mental health workers. And it's almost like a sign of weakness, I guess, that if you've been diagnosed this way, that, just through sheer willpower, you're going to go out and try to heal thyself or whatever the case might be, or I'll show them. Right. And of course, that when you have a diagnosis of schizophrenia and you're going around untreated, that's a problem. And what's really interesting is that, Baumeister had shown evidences of really odd, aberrant behavior, even as a young man. There's stories of him playing with dead animals. There's actually, he was apparently a urophile, which is one of the philias. He had a fascination with urine. He had been, I think, working. Let's see, what was it? He was working in at some organization like in where he would have access to the mail, and there was a letter that was addressed that was either originated from this location or was coming in. I can't remember now. Addressed to like the governor of Indiana, and he urinated on the envelope.
My God! And this is Baumeister we're talking about.
Yeah, this is Baumeister that we're talking about. So he had these paraphilias, at least one that we know of, which is this kind of aberrant sexual fascination, that he would have, and. I look at, and not only that, but he was always described as being very odd. I watched an interview with one of his former employees who'd been a teenager. Now, get this, tell me this, I bet this man is terrified every single day. He kind of reflects back. He had been 15 years old and had worked for Baumeister at the Save-A-Lot, one of the Save-A-Lot thrift stores, not to be confused with Save-A-Lot grocery stores. We have those all over the South. There's a lot of people that go to them. They're fine stores. It's not the same thing. These thrift stores that he owned were in the Indianapolis area. And so this young man was talking about how they would take in items like you do, at a thrift store. My wife spends a lot of time in thrift stores, so I know this sort of thing. She loves going to them with my daughter. And, they have to sort all of this stuff that comes in, and you put it in separate bins, by whatever the item is. Is it jackets, or is it pants, or is it shoes, or is it children's toys? And he described how Baumeister would present in this really, he would become highly agitated if there was something that had been discarded as like worthless that they couldn't use, and that the kid had tossed it aside or put it on the side and didn't include it in the bin that would go out on the floor. And not that some other person would not have, been equally as enraged, but he said it was almost at an inappropriate level, and people were terrified anytime to see him coming. And he tries to comport himself as this young business dude that had been very successful, and he's moving up the ladder. He's got himself a wife. Right. He's got himself 3 kids. He's got he's got this big spread. The only thing about it is at this point in time, and like, kind of echoing what this young man had said in the interview, no one knew that there were thousands of particulated body parts that were on that property that had been crushed up. The last thing I'll say about this interview, the young man said that he had been literally in the store alone with him at night. This kid was 15 when this was going on. And he thought, that could have been me, that could have happened to. And Baumeister would slip away and not be there for protracted periods of time, then this kid was kind of reminiscing over this and saying, I wonder when he was not at the store and I was working for him, was he cruising the bars in Indianapolis and picking out victims and taking them and torturing and killing them and then disposing of their remains?
That's a rough thing to live with.
Oh, my gosh.
Basically,
it really is.
Now, in 1994, Baumeister picks up a guy in the neighborhood of an Indianapolis gay bar, and he brings him out to their home for a sexual encounter. But the man says he's so lucky he escaped alive that he went to cops. Now, this is a very short Cliff's version of the, what are those things you use in college?
Cliff Notes.
Yeah, Cliff Notes. All right. Because we don't know a whole lot of what went on. We know that it was a consensual homosexual encounter that was planned, yet whatever happened, this guy got out and went straight to the cops saying he felt lucky to be alive. And this is, again, where I'm back to that time period. I guess in 1994, Joe, there had been so much talk of the Jeffrey Dahmer case nationwide that I'm struck by this story of a man comes into the police department and says, I'm really afraid of what just took place. And this encounter matches up with what we know of Jeffrey Dahmer. And it's in that same time period. Why couldn't they put two and two together and at least look at him? Oh, wait a minute, Joe. They did. They did put two and two together, and they started looking at Baumeister. So I'm thinking this is 1994.
Yeah.
Now, we know, we've already said that Baumeister took his own life just a couple of years later.
Yep.
So from the 94 incident when this man goes to police saying, I'm lucky to be alive, and they were able to put things together and realize we might have a bad actor here. We might have a guy.
Yeah, they did. And they had confirmatory information, Dave, from another person as well, where this guy reported, there was a guy at one of these bars that reported that his friend was missing. And he tried to give a description of the guy. And the cops told him at the time, if you see him again, let us know. And the guy's using a very specific nom de guerre, a false name at this particular time. Sure enough, he shows up again. And you talk about developing probable cause. This guy gets his license plate.
Wow.
And so when he gets that information, so you've got these two sources that are coming at you. And this is an investigator's ultimate dream here, where you can get multiple confirmatory sources. They were able at that point in time to go and begin to question or begin to watch Baumeister and what he was doing. And that led them to this farm that he possessed. And strangely enough, Baumeister, they came to this location where these bodies had already been deposited. Can you imagine being a cop and you're on the same 19 acres that there are tens of bodies located on, and you know that something's up. Your spidey senses are tingling, and you're talking to this guy. Do you mind if we come in and just kind of look through your property? No, you can't. They show up when he's not there. They ask his wife, and his wife is like fervent. No, you can't. Well, as time went by, she got a little bit scared. She got scared of what he might do and his behavior, because suddenly, isn't it odd that you can be married to somebody and maybe not think that their behavior is odd because it becomes so normalized in your life, their appearance, their actions, their responses to things. And all of a sudden it takes like a sudden jolt or, a splash of cold water in the face to say, wait, I need to wake up from this fantasy I'm living in. I'm scared of this guy now. And as it turns out, they wind up getting a warrant for the property. But, Baumeister knew that all was at an end at this point in time, that he was in an unrecoverable flat spin at this point. And I guess he interpreted that as, I have nothing that I can do. I'm going to hop in my car and I'm heading out to the Great White North. And, of course, that ended with him blowing his brains out up there.
When we looked at his suicide, he used a .357, right?
Yeah.
what would that do in terms of the actual physicalness of something like that? I mean, is that going to just be blood pouring out of the mouth, or is it going to be an exit wound that blows out the back of your head?
It all depends on, first off, where the shot is initiated, where the point of entrance is. If anyone is familiar with the case of the former Secretary of Treasury for the state of Pennsylvania, Bud Dwyer, that went on
that was on camera
at a news conference. Yeah. As a matter of fact, when that happened, I was still working in New Orleans, and we had a friend of ours that was a reporter and got us the first unedited edition of that. And back then, during that period of time, I think that was the late 80s, early 90s. I can't remember Bud Dwyer, but at any rate, that old adage about the camera never blinks. Well, he used a 357 Magnum, and that was an intraoral gunshot wound where he takes it out of a paper bag, sticks it the muzzle in his mouth. And for a second, if you slow it down, you can actually see his cheeks expand with the gaseous expansion. Because one of the things you learn about the destructive, people always ask me relative to gunshot wounds, what is it that people naturally think that it's the projectile that is doing so much disruption to the head? And yes, it does. I'd be a fool to say otherwise. However, the other piece of this is the rapidly expanding gas. We all know scientifically that hot air always expands, okay? Always expands. It doesn't contract. And people might not realize the force of this hot gas as it comes out of the muzzle of the weapon. It's looking to expand out as far as it possibly can. Well, you're firing out of a barrel, projectiles coming out, but the hot gas is coming out as well. Well, if it's an intraoral gunshot wound, it's going to find that gas is going to find the weakest spots. If you feel along the roof of your mouth with the tip of your tongue, the bony surface up there, you've actually got what is referred to as a palatine suture, which is, and there's actually three, I think. There's a primary that runs down, a central one, and then there's two, and like, see if we flipped it, it would be running east and west and kind of north and south, like points of a compass. I was going to say in the vertical plane, the horizontal plane, but we won't do that. Those are the weakest spots in the mouth. So those sutures that draw our body together as we're forming in mommy's tummy, those are weak spots. And so when you see heads that will open up, first off, those will part, the hard palate will split, the gas is continued to travel up through the cranial vault and when it gets into the cranial vault, you've got sutures that are on the outside. And when I'm saying sutures, guys, I'm not saying sutures like you're sewing something up like a wound. Suture lines are these points of fusion that run along our skulls. And so those are weak spots. And if you see a skull, do yourself a favor, look at a human skull and look at those kind of real interlocking plates. You'll see the suture line that runs across there, and the plates are actually locked together. It looks like teeth. Those are suture lines. And so that expanding gas will fracture along those lines. So you'll have these heads that will come apart. So yeah, a 357 Magnum would certainly do that. I find it very interesting that he chose a weapon like that, Baumeister, to do this. But when it came to killing his victims, we'll never, I don't think, know how many of the victims were killed that were found at Fox Hollow. However, what we do have is, if we are to believe that he was in fact the I-70 strangler, we have a real insight into what his methodology was. Why did it vary with him? Why didn't he wrap a noose around his neck and hang himself? Why didn't he do that? You know, if he's so fixated on depriving individuals of oxygen, these poor men that had no idea it was coming, he wrapped his hands around their throats and squeezed the life out of him. It looks as though the Baumeister was rather merciful to himself. I got to sing the praises of somebody real quick here. These people go without name most of the time and unheralded heroes. And who I'm talking about are elected coroners. They do more in-depth investigation than people will ever know. They, in their own little way, they grieve for these individuals that have no one else to grieve for them. And I know that's very theatrical. I apologize for that. However, please hear me right when I say this. They're really the only ones that the dead remain fresh in the minds of. Okay. All these individuals that are unidentified out there. And the person I really want to sing the praises of here is the Hamilton County coroner in Hamilton, Indiana, Jeff Jellison. Jeff actually took upon himself the mission of getting bodies identified, particularly those that were involved in the Fox Hollow case. Now, Hamilton is immediately adjacent to the Indianapolis area, and he took it upon himself to try to do his best to take these, again, particulated, crushed, burned remains and put a name with them. I would love to interview this guy and to talk to him about what that process was like, particularly, going back all these years. What I think that one of the things that I always reflect upon, particularly relative to my career, is that, I had cases involving lots of bodies at one time, but as you go forward in time and you're still working as a death investigator, that at that moment in time, it was a huge deal when you're out there recovering remains. But there are other cases that begin to kind of stack on top of even a mass death event where the things aren't as fresh. Jeff Jellison actually literally breathed life into this case, Dave, where he had recovered these remains. His office had recovered these remains, and he was holding tight, wanting to finish the job. Let me just remind everybody, because I've done a whole episode on the coroners before. Our primary goal as medical legal death investigators is not to solve homicides. That's not what we do. That is the job of the police. Now, if we provide information to them and it helps, God bless, go in peace. I hope that it does help. Our main job, and you have to know what your job is in order to do it, right? Our main job in the medical legal field is to determine the cause of death, the manner of death, and the third leg to the stool is identification of the dead. That's it. That's what we do. And kind of a subset of the identification of the dead is to try to find the family. In this particular case, involving this poor young man who apparently died at the hands of Baumeister, Dave, his parents were dead and all of his siblings were dead. There was nothing left, but there was one thing that happened. His mother actually died of a drug OD. And I've never talked about this on air. At the time of her death, when she died, they took a blood card on her. And that's something we don't talk about much, that people don't know.
What is that?
Morgue. There is a particular type of little card. If you'll envision the size of a business card, everybody's ever worked in where you had business cards. It's the size of a business card. And you syringe up blood from the victim, and you take and you put one little droplet of blood. There's two separate boxes, one in one box and one in the other, and you retain it. You store it appropriately and you retain it. And guess what, Dave? That blood that they took at that autopsy ultimately led to the identification of this young man. And you know, one other thing, Coral, his daughter, the police didn't even know he had a daughter, because that would have obviously have been the person you would have gone to. It actually took the blood of his deceased mother in order to aid in getting this young man's body identified.
So they didn't know, because they don't know who they have. They don't know anything. There's nothing to go on. You mentioned something at the very start, about an offhanded comment about from Coral about, oh, maybe, there's this serial killer over here, or maybe there's something to it. All I'm thinking, and I mentioned this to you earlier, was when we talk about Othram and what they're doing in helping families, this is like, to me, it's the textbook. I didn't even know what you were talking about when you said they got a card on her, on his mom.
Yeah.
I didn't know what was going on with any of that. All I knew is that there was a young woman who didn't know where her dad was.
Yep.
Didn't think he was dead, but didn't know. She had no idea if he was right around the corner or if he had been killed, because his death, first of all, the guy was 20 years old. He was a young man. His baby is 2 years old when he's told to go home, pretty much. And that's it. She has no relationship with him. And in her whole adult life growing up, trying to figure out life, it's tough enough. But when you've got that big question mark in the back of your head, you look for answers.
In addition to Daniel Halloran, Mr. Jellison got another young man identified, Alan Livingston, who's 27 when he went missing in August of 93. He got him identified. And not only that, he also reconfirmed through DNA matches, and this is Jellison, 2 of the 8 original victims that had been identified back in the 1990s. He was able to reconfirm their identity. Because, you're dealing with, just to imagine what a nightmare this is. I've already told you of my disdain for jigsaw puzzles. It's not something I have the patience for. Okay, imagine the ultimate jigsaw puzzle. You've got thousands of commingled, fragmented remains that are in various states of decay, many of them burned. And you just look at this mess that you have before you. And, for all you know, this animal is out there killing people and then stirring the remains together, mixing them all up. And it is such a hodgepodge to be able to do this, to try to put a name with these fragmented remains. And ultimately, that is, in fact, what had happened in the case of Daniel and these other cases. And there's still, I think, to date, if I'm not mistaken, somebody make sure you go back and check me on this, but okay, I think there's still 3 that they're looking to get identified at this point. And that brings me to this. Our friends at Othram try to move heaven and hell with limited resources. They do things that 50 years ago, this would have seemed like it was an episode of Star Trek. It is so amazing what they have literally been able to do and almost breathe the breath of life into these old cases where families just didn't know. And that leads me to what I always say about Othram. It might be the most noble work that is going on at that point in time. There are thousands and thousands of unidentified persons that are out there. They're not all homicides, but yet at some point in time, some person out there held them right after they were born, and they were somebody's baby. And since that time, they died lonely deaths, or were killed, or were discarded without a name. Othram Labs is giving them a name, and you can help. All you have to do is go to dnasolves.org. You go to dnasolves.org. You look through the list. If it's regional to you, if it's in your state, if they have cases in your state that are open and need funding, just a few bucks thrown their way could make the difference. Could make the difference to give families the answer for the empty chair that they have always had at Thanksgiving. Just do it. Just go check it out. Pick out a case that you want to support. Throw your support behind. Give them whatever you have, whatever you're capable of giving. And you could be the reason that someone finally has answers. Tip of the cap to our friends at Othram Labs in the Woodlands, Texas, but also special recognition to coroner Jeff Jellison for his continued efforts and to try to bring answers to these families that have no idea that maybe their family member was a victim of Herb Baumeister. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.